I went back to our team after that experience and I said, we've got to look at pediatric critical care. I think they could really use this technology and it would fill a big gap. And so that is how AcQumen Medical was born.
That was Dori Jones, co-founder and CEO of AcQumen Medical, a company on a mission to close one of pediatric critical care's most glaring gaps: the lack of real-time, non-invasive hemodynamic monitoring for babies and children in the ICU. AcQumen Medical is developing UltraTrack, a first-of-its-kind monitoring platform that combines bioimpedance and ultrasound technology to measure cardiac output, blood flow, and vascular resistance without an invasive catheter. Built for the smallest and most vulnerable patients, UltraTrack is designed to give clinicians the data they need to intervene earlier. Welcome to the Biotech Stack, where we go behind the science to meet the founders and leaders building the tools, platforms, and technologies that make discovery possible. From lab automation and AI-driven research to genomics, diagnostics, and clinical technologies, we cover the full stack, from the R&D bench all the way to the clinical lab. I'm Corinne Regan, your host. And in today's episode, I'm joined by Dori Jones, co-founder and CEO of AcQumen Medical. A mechanical engineer turned medtech executive, Dori's career spans heart pump development, clinical marketing, and commercialization strategy. But it was her deeply personal experience watching her infant son in the ICU with little more than a pulse oximeter taped to his toe that crystallized her mission. Dori shares the founding story behind AcQumen Medical, how UltraTrack's novel combination of bioimpedance and ultrasound is giving pediatric clinicians access to data they've never had before, and what her vision for where AcQumen Medical goes next. Let's get started. Dori, thank you so much for joining us today. I was hoping you could take us through your journey, who you are, your background, and what led you to start AcQumen Medical.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Corinne, and to Biotech Stack for hosting me and AcQumen Medical. Really excited to share what we're building. So as you said, my name is Dori. I am the co-founder and CEO of AcQumen Medical. We are developing a pediatric innovation for children and babies in the ICU, specifically a monitoring system. And I'll get into a little bit of the story of how we came to that application of our technology. But as far as my background, so I'm an engineer. I did my undergrad in mechanical engineering. I thought I was going to work on cars, and my first job out of college was with a heart pump company called Sunshine Heart, which was actually in Australia. And I said, Sunshine Heart, why would they want an engineer? And they said, it's a pump. And I said, okay, if it's a pump, I'm on board. I'm game. And so I fell in love with that space and said, this is what I want to do with my career. And I had an opportunity to work with that same company several years later in the States on their feasibility study. And I was in the OR, in the ICU, seeing the implantation of these devices. And I hadn't taken a bio class even since high school. So I did go back and got my master's in biomedical engineering. And that really led me into more of sort of a clinical education and marketing role with that company. And that then became sort of the second half of my career, was for marketing and commercialization and strategic planning. And how do we actually get technologies from the engineers to the patients that need it, and what's everything in between. And so along the way, I became really passionate about the actual application of those technologies. And in the case of heart pumps, one of the things that we always want to know is, what are the parameters that we can measure to understand the impact of that heart pump? And so the term hemodynamics is one that I use a lot, but isn't necessarily mainstream. So hemodynamics is a measure of how blood flows through the body to deliver oxygen and nutrients and all the things carried by the blood. And so I had always been curious, how can we better understand a patient's hemodynamics? And today, the sort of gold standard to measure something like blood flow, cardiac output, how many liters per minute of blood is flowing from the heart, takes these invasive procedures. So they'll put a catheter in the patient's neck or groin, and usually the tip of the catheter has to go into the heart to adequately measure cardiac output. And so there are many folks that have attempted to find non-invasive ways to do that. And my team of engineers and med tech professionals had come up with an idea to address that. And that was to combine two different techniques, two different non invasive ways of measuring blood flow into one. But when we were first talking about it, there were so many potential applications. So I mentioned heart pumps. I mean, primarily heart pumps are used in heart failure patients, which is mostly adults, sometimes pediatric patients. I've worked on pediatric heart pumps as well. But we sort of had this wide array of potential applications. And then on New Year's Day of 2023, my son ended up in the pediatric ICU. He had also been in the NICU as a baby. This was 4 months later, and it was a very challenging experience emotionally for sure. But it was also sort of, a mental tax of what are they using to monitor my kid, and why do they not have the same tools that they have in the adult ICUs? Because I've spent so much time in adult ICUs. And, there's a million monitors going on in that case. So
Right.
for my son, it was just periodic blood pressure and a pulse oximeter, which measures oxygen, that they had to wrap around his toe because he was so small. And he kept kicking it off. And so it would just beep, and eventually, we'd turn it off. And I went back to our team after that experience and I said, we've got to look at pediatric critical care. I think they could really use this technology and it would fill a big gap. And so that is how AcQumen Medical was born.
Okay. Well, how is your son today? Was this hopefully just a blip on the radar, or do you mind sharing some info on that?
Yeah, gratefully, he had an amazing team at that hospital. It was an academic center, and he's doing fine today. He's going to be 4 in a couple months, so he's running around like a crazy 3-year-old boy does, and is doing well. Yes, thank you for asking.
Well, that's good. I have also a crazy 3-year-old boy who will be 4 soon, and it's a wild ride. So I have 2 more questions from this story. When you met your, it sounds like partners in AcQumen Medical, were you all coming from the same company? Was this an academic setting? How did you meet these folks that you were able to partner with on this idea?
Yeah. So there are 5 co-founders of AcQumen Medical, and the 4 of the 5 of us had worked together at a company, interestingly, that had both an adult and a pediatric application of a technology for fluid management, which is used quite a lot in the ICU, but also can be used in heart failure patients, so can be used even outpatient or on a non-ICU floor in the hospital, but was being used for a long time off label in babies, actually. And I was part of the team that went to FDA to pursue a pediatric indication. So our team has actually worked on pediatric med tech together before. But to answer your question more directly, we had stayed in touch. The chief technology officer for AcQumen was working on another technology in the ultrasound space and hired me as a strategic advisor to this early stage startup.
Hmm.
And so our team was sort of working together on a different innovation when this idea came up. And one of the team members called me in the spring of 2024, so right before we were founded, and after I had been exploring this pediatric application of our technology. And he said, hey, this thing that we're working on, this pediatric idea, I think it's its own company. And so we should start it and you should take the lead. And I said, I'm not sure I know how to do that. And he said, sure you do. And so yeah, here we are 2 years later, and I think he was right. We're doing it.
Well, there you go. I love it. So you've kind of alluded to this a little bit. We've talked about cardiac pumps. You've talked about non-invasive versus invasive, what kind of exists in the marketplace. But could you describe in a little more detail, like what is it that AcQumen Medical does? What
Yeah.
is the exact problem you're trying to solve if there's only one, and of course, how exactly you're trying to solve it.
Yes. So we are developing a monitoring system and platform. So there's kind of two aspects of our technology. There's sort of the med tech, hard tech monitoring system, which is going to give us access to these values that the doctors are missing, specifically in the pediatric setting where they don't want to do those invasive catheter procedures. It's a high risk, especially the smaller the patient gets. And then there's the analytics platform, which I'll come back to in a little bit. So, as far as the device itself, I mentioned that we're combining two different non invasive methods. So, the first method is using bioimpedance. And so, if you've ever used one of those scales where you have to stand on it with your bare feet and like hold on to a handlebar, and it's actually using a tiny electrical current to make calculations, and you can get, in addition to your weight, things like BMI and body fat content, and so that's using principles of bioimpedance. Well, you can
Okay.
use those same principles of bioimpedance to look at the blood that's flowing from the heart and out to the rest of the body. So we do that using electrodes. They look very much like EKG electrodes. So if you've gotten an EKG at the doctor, little stickies that go in various locations on the skin. In our case, it's 4 different locations on the skin. But instead of measuring electrical activity, which is what an EKG does, we're actually looking at the sort of mechanical activity of the heart. So, what is the volume of blood coming from the heart? What is the flow of blood coming from the heart? What is the resistance to the blood flowing from the heart? So, your systemic vascular resistance may not always be aligned with your blood flow because your blood vessels can tighten and contract. And so, with different conditions, you may have sort of a discordance of those two values. And that can tell you a lot about what's happening with the patient. And so, that's the impedance device. And it uses a method essentially of looking at a waveform and calculating an area under the curve. And what's critical to that calculation is knowing the exact timing of the cardiac cycle. So, exactly when is the heart pumping? When does the valve open and close specifically? And there can be limitations in this impedance technology. We're using surface skin electrodes, so they may be subject to patient movement or sort of slippage or bad connections. They could be, in some cases, susceptible to noise or
Mm.
electrical interference. So, if you have any sort of noise on that waveform, it may give you faulty results. So, the first thing that we're doing is we're integrating ultrasound. So, now ultrasound is our second methodology for measuring blood flow. And we're looking at the timing of the heart, the timing of the cardiac cycle using ultrasound. And that sort of validates and verifies the values that we get from our impedance device.
Okay.
And then in the future, we can also use ultrasound as an independent measurement of flow. So another sort of gold standard in measuring flow would be ultrasound. So echocardiography, or in some cases, point of care ultrasound. But this is our way of improving and calibrating and refining the measurements that are coming from this impedance device. And then I mentioned part 2 is, okay, we have these numbers that we can display, like cardiac output, stroke volume, systemic vascular resistance. Also, we can measure the fluid content in the chest, because we can look at the raw impedance across the chest, which is very much influenced by fluid. So, pulmonary congestion, which is a common issue in the ICU, is something that we can trend over time. But we also can analyze the waveforms produced by that device and learn even more about the patient. So that's where the analytics comes in, of being able to provide the clinicians with insight about what else is happening with the patient. Like, what does their valve function look like? How much fluid is in the bloodstream versus outside of the bloodstream? So there's all this robust physiologic data in the waveform itself. And so we're building out the tools to analyze that and build the tools to help those clinicians care for the patients better.
Gotcha. And so you mentioned that the solution was originally created to help with pediatric patients that would need a lot of this monitoring. But this does sound like it would be useful, and it doesn't sound like it's something that exists on the market otherwise, even in adult patients. One, is that true? And two, is there an opportunity to expand? I understand that pediatrics is a great place to be and it's an important place to be. I'm just trying to get a better understanding of the future of the company and if that's on the radar.
Yes and yes.
Okay.
So it is true that this combination of impedance and ultrasound has never been done before to measure hemodynamics. It really is the core of our intellectual property. And I will say, while there are unique aspects of both of the technologies, we think that they're really powerful, as standalone individual technologies. It's really putting the two together and how we process that data that is, novel and new. I will give you a little show and tell. So
Ooh, okay.
this is actually the ultrasound that's in testing today.
Okay.
So if anybody's ever had an ultrasound, I mean, for me, when I was pregnant, certainly I had an ultrasound. It's very small compared to most of the ultrasounds that you may have experienced. So this goes on the patient's neck, and we're actually looking at the blood flowing through the carotid. And it
Okay.
was designed for a small patient. But it can also work in adults, as does our impedance device. And in fact, our impedance technology is a device that was on the market before and was primarily used in adults. So it has 510(k) clearance with the FDA. We have our custom ultrasound, and again, it's the integration of the two that we're really studying and then building our platform around. But there's so many reasons that we are starting in pediatrics. For one, it's a true gap in care. In adults, they do still use, as an example, a Swan-Ganz catheter to measure cardiac output. And that's not to say that it wouldn't be preferable to be non-invasive, but they have that capability and they know that it's the gold standard. Whereas in pediatrics, a lot of times they're just missing that data completely. And, if you think about going to the doctor and getting blood pressure and heart rate, that's really just a limited view. So just as far as physics and science in general, right? So I'm an engineer. I love to nerd out on this kind of stuff. You've got pressure and you've got rate, but volume is a huge part of the equation. And actually, the volume of blood coming from your heart, and hence the blood flow, which is just multiplying that by heart rate, changes a lot more acutely than your blood pressure. So your body will do anything it
Oh,
can
okay.
to sort of maintain blood pressure, right? So if your cardiac output is going down, your body will respond and actually restrict your blood vessels so that you can still get more of that blood around the body. So your blood pressure stays up here, even though your blood flow is starting to do this. So if you could capture those changes earlier, you might be able to intervene, because by the time the blood pressure is going down, the patient is crashing. And now there's a real intervention that's needed. And so, one of the reasons we're doing this is to really give those physicians time to react and intervene so that you can prevent the patient from crashing. So that's reason one, is it's really an unmet need in pediatrics.
Okay.
Certainly my passion for it comes from my own experience with my son. And I wish we had had UltraTrack when he was in the ICU. And it's also the nature of our experience as a team with the pediatric community. They're incredibly collaborative. They have been very responsive to our ideas and the ability to research UltraTrack because they know it's an unmet need in their patient population. And so we see them as very much innovators, early adopters. And so it takes less commercial resources actually to bring this to market for pediatrics than it would for adults. And having done both, I will say you really need a large commercial team to bring a monitoring system into the ICU, whereas we can do a lot in the pediatric space first, prove our value proposition, And then it's much easier from an engineering standpoint to take a device that's small and use it on a
Yes.
big patient. And in fact, it's not like we have to make this bigger. This will work in an adult as well.
Okay.
Versus the other way around, a lot of people design for adult first and then, oh, well, this is going to take some rework. How can you get this down to the size of a pediatric patient, especially in neonates? So if we start small, it's easy to go big.
That's really smart. We actually met a company who did a CPAP machine, and they're trying to reverse engineer it for a pediatric patient because these things are too small. You're not getting the right oxygen flow because of the design and the shape and the way it sits on a child's face versus an adult. So I love that you're taking the opposite approach.
Yeah.
Very smart. I'd love to talk a little bit more about this commercialization approach. You've now mentioned that there are partnerships with physicians in the pediatric space. This is a really great space to collaborate. Can you go into a little bit more detail? What is the strategy to bring this product to market? You mentioned that there is probably other efforts outside of just making partnerships with physicians, maybe a sales and marketing team. As much as you'd love to share, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'll start with the validation of our technology. So it's really important that one, we're studying this in a pediatric population. So I mentioned that there are others that are attempting to measure hemodynamics non-invasively. Very few of them have validated their technologies in pediatric patients. So it's really important that we study in the right population. And so in our case, we want to be able to compare with the gold standard. In the few cases where a pediatric patient does go to the cath lab, we're able to put our device on in the cath lab and take our measurements simultaneous with the catheter measurements so that we can compare how
Okay.
does our device work compared with this gold standard. And that then gives us the trust and the faith by the physicians in the numbers that they're seeing. We feel very good about the trending of our device already because our impedance device, as I said, has been on the market before and has shown good correlation with, is their cardiac output going up or going down? And it has really strong concordance with other measurements in that sense. So that's part one. And then our second tier of studies will be in the ICU. So now let's test this in the environment that we're planning it to be used in and study what's the impact of now having those numbers where you never did before. So, how does it impact clinical decision making and hence patient outcomes? How does it impact healthcare costs? That's a huge piece of our value proposition is we're talking about in the NICU and pediatric ICU, these really large inpatient payments. They're called DRG payments, but it's a fixed payment. So it's this payment, regardless of how many days they spend in the ICU, how many resources. So, can we actually show that there's cost savings by capturing these changes in the patient status earlier and intervening sooner and having that guidance and that feedback from our monitoring system to guide their treatments as well. So that's part two. And then that part two will align with our commercialization strategy. So starting with our research partners, that have experience with this device, we'll do sort of a pilot launch. And so our plan is to have 3 territories where we hire a small commercial team, including clinical specialists that can really help with that workflow implementation in the ICU setting. Ideally, they come from a pediatric healthcare background. And that will be our sort of early go-to-market strategy, will be that pilot launch. Certainly, the publication of these studies will be aligned with that, and then attending conferences and trade shows to share with the world that we've actually cracked the code on non-invasive cardiac output.
Okay. I love that. Talking about the conference space, this is obviously an important opportunity to get your technology in front of lots of faces. Are there particular conferences that you're really excited about that have just proven to be a really valuable way of getting that message out?
Yes, definitely. Well, there's there's an interesting strategy for us because there are a handful of pediatric specific conferences, and some that even get as specific as the Neonatal Heart Society,
Oh,
where
wow.
we would specifically be, promoting the use of this in the neonatal population where they have a lot of complex patients with congenital heart disease. And so, that would be sort of a sure fit for us. But some of the other broader applications would be in critical care medicine. So the Society for Critical Care Medicine does an annual congress, and there's actually a huge pediatric presence at that conference. So we've gone for the last 2 years since AcQumen was founded, and actually found a number of our partners at that SCCM Congress. And
Oh,
so the ability to share this, more broadly with the critical care community, critical care being any type of ICU. So the NICU, the cardiac ICU, the pediatric ICU would be included, but certainly, exposes us to the adult community as well.
gotcha. And then in addition to conferences to getting this exposure, I know that there's a lot of innovation groups that have come about over the last several years. I believe you guys were part of an innovation group this year. Do you mind sharing on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so we are super excited and honored to be part of the 2026 cohort for MedTech Innovator. So, that is the largest global accelerator program for medical technologies. And we are one of two pediatric companies in that cohort,
Okay.
which is very exciting. And they provide a lot of resources. They really are a sort of ecosystem within the medtech industry. So, even some of the judges that were reviewing us as a company to determine if we would get in included physicians, hospital systems, payers. It included regulatory experts, people from the FDA, as an example.
Oh,
It
wow.
included med tech consultants that have worked with startup companies for decades. And so, bringing kind of all of the different stakeholders to the table to evaluate your technology, your innovation, and your company. And so that was huge validation for us getting through that initial sort of round of review. There were, I think it was 4% of the applicants that actually got accepted into the program this year. So that was really sort of a thrill for us. And now we're in the program. And so we have a lot of workshops. One of the workshops is specifically around that value proposition piece. And so, what is the value we bring to those different stakeholders? How is this viewed from the aspect of the payer, right? It's not just the patient. And in our case, the patient's caregiver, right? Because it's the parent making most of the decisions.
Right.
And then the physicians, of course, but there's a lot of other stakeholders as well. And then we will finish up that MedTech Innovator program at the AdvaMed conference in October, which is in Boston this year. And that's our opportunity to showcase our work and the progress that we've made through that program.
Well, congratulations. Top 4%. That's pretty incredible.
Thank you.
And you'll have to keep us updated on how the October event pans out.
Yeah, definitely.
So, in addition to this innovation cohort that you guys were accepted into this year, you also received a grant from BARDA. Do you mind sharing a little bit more on the details behind that?
Yes. So BARDA is, just in case there's folks that haven't heard of them, it's the Biomedical Advanced R&D Authority. So they are a government agency under HHS. And their job is to promote innovation for medical countermeasures. So think preparedness for natural disasters, pandemics, radiologic events, anything that would sort of overwhelm the US hospital systems. And so, what innovations can help to counteract those, mass events that may include mass casualty, unfortunately. And they have a program that is a collaboration with Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C., called Spark for Innovation in Pediatrics. So they're specifically interested in pediatric medical countermeasures. So, what can we do for the 25% of our population that's under the age of 18? Because they're going to be impacted just as much, if not more, by these
Right.
events. And so they are supporting us in some of the innovation behind UltraTrack specifically, and we're looking at doing a study at Children's National as part of that grant. But they're also funding some of those computational tools that I mentioned that go into the analytics platform. And
Okay.
so, with that support from BARDA, we'll be developing a pediatric digital twin where we can essentially use UltraTrack to recreate the physiology of this patient and better understand as a whole the status that they are in right now, and also what could their status be in the future. So even some of the predictive analytics, like if we were to give this patient a bolus of fluid, what would that do to their cardiac output? And all of those other pieces of the puzzle have to come into play. So I mentioned before, there's the heart rate, the blood pressure, and the blood flow, but also there's that resistance that may be built up in the arterial system. So all of those interplay depending on the patient's condition. And so by having a system like UltraTrack, we can really create this robust model to evaluate that patient's status and understand what treatments would be most appropriate.
Amazing. Well, now that we've had a chance to learn a little bit about where you are today, looking ahead, what does the future, maybe this year, even into the next 5 to 10, look like for AcQumen Medical?
Yeah, so this is definitely our year of V&V. So we are
Okay.
doing clinical studies, bench testing, and everything that's going to be involved in validating our technology, going through the FDA process. We are looking to commercialize in 2027. And then certainly there's lots of opportunities to expand throughout the children's hospital system first. In the background, we can be preparing for the adult market. I see the biggest opportunity for impact being through strategic partnership or acquisition. So some of the leaders in the critical care monitoring space, may be interested in getting UltraTrack into as many critical care units as possible. But there's also opportunity beyond the ICU setting. So, yes, we are collecting this really robust data that you would want access to in an ICU. But because we're doing it non invasively, you could use it outside the ICU as well. And so, I'll give an example. We're working closely with pediatric cardiologists and cardiac surgeons. And
Okay.
there's a very high rate of congenital heart disease in our country. And unfortunately, it is a very deadly disease. And one of the areas of sort of highest concern is when those patients go home in between surgeries. And so, could we actually use UltraTrack in the home? And that's one of the things that we're exploring for the future. And the start is certainly in the ICU where, we have a really thorough understanding of that implementation, but there's so many possibilities to help pediatric patients and beyond once we get those early learnings.
That's awesome. That's a great trajectory to have something that could be at in-home care at some point in the future too. Well, I appreciate you sharing all this information, and we're excited to see where the future goes for AcQumen Medical.
Thank you so much, Corinne. We're really excited to share, and hopefully we can keep in touch. Thank you for everything that you do to expose the world to cool innovations.
We'd like to thank our guest, Dori Jones, co-founder and CEO of AcQumen Medical, for joining us on the Biotech Stack. For more information on Dori or AcQumen Medical, please check the links in our show notes below. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.